delighted to welcome Margaret Murphy back to Fine Arts Festival.
Thank you, Paul and John, and thank you, Mike. And thanks to everybody for being here tonight. It's wonderful to be back here with you. Our next two guests have, in different ways, revolutionized both theater and television. They both tell important stories that until recently were invisible and overlooked. And in compelling, sometimes funny, shocking, or heartbreaking ways, they have both dramatized some of the most urgent social issues of our time. Paula Vogel has written 22 plays, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning How I Learned to Drive, and her newest, the critically acclaimed Indecent, now on Broadway. It recently won 2 Tonys and has gone into an extended run. As a teacher, she has also nurtured playwrights like Lynn Nottage and Sarah Rule. Ryan Murphy is an Emmy Award-winning television producer and director and has created such lauded and hugely successful shows as Nip Tuck, Glee, American Horror Story, American Crime, and the recently premiered Feud. His adaptation of Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart won an Emmy for Best Television Movie. Talking with Ryan Murphy and Paula Vogel is a favorite son of the Work Center and one of today's most widely honored writers, who has also written 2 highly regarded screenplays. He is the author of 7 novels, a collection of short stories, and perhaps the best short book about our beloved town, Land's End, a walk in Provincetown. Since coming to the Work Center in 1980, he's received numerous accolades and won both the Penn Faulkner Award and the Pulitzer Prize. For all his acclaim, he's written, "If I die tomorrow, Provincetown is where I'd want my ashes scattered. Who knows why we fall in love with places or people, objects or desires." Please welcome Michael Cunningham, Ryan Murphy, and Paula Vogel.
I'm going to need a microphone. Can people hear me back there?
Yes. Yeah, I'm going to start with the microphone. If I feel.
Maybe not sit on the pillow. Yeah.
I did. Anyway, bumped out. I will throw it over my shoulder. This is such a pleasure and a thrill. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk. There's so I could ask 100 questions and go on deep into the night, but I think we're going to focus on diversity and inclusiveness. Paula, you said the purpose of theater and television is to bring into the public that which is kept off stage. Let's talk about that which is kept off stage. One of the first questions I ask my students in my writing and literature classes is, what is the purpose of narrative in whatever form? What does it do in the world? Does it have a political, social, moral purpose? If so, what about that? What do you think? Why would you start first?
You know, I have to say, and I fall in love with every aesthetic. And I will find myself rigorously fighting for art's sake. and love that. I will fall in love with entertainment is the primary purpose, and I will fall in love with that. And I will fall in love with Bertolt Brecht and the need to have a kind of political confrontation. In other words, I believe that there's a spectrum of aesthetics, and that, I don't know if this is true for your work as well, if you find yourself actually driven by the work and not by your own aesthetic, that worlds come to us with their own demands, and we have to actually mold ourselves into that world. So depending on, and I know you do this, right? Depending on your characters in terms of the world itself, in terms of the historical period, you actually find, I feel that I'm the first audience member. And I am on this trip. And I go for that trip, and I don't enforce my own voice on that trip that I'm taking. So, I mean, how flexible are we over a lifetime, and how many infatuations do we have? I am forever falling in love with different playwrights, with different directors, with different filmmakers, and I find myself smitten. So, I know that we all are supposedly, that we have voices. I can tell you what the last Playworld's voice is, but I can't tell you before that, if that makes sense.
I can't decide whether to use a mic or not. I used to be in the theater, so I'll try not to. I agree with you. My feeling about my work and what I do is, first of all, it's Hollywood. So at this point in my life, and I'm 52, I sort of feel that what I'm interested in, what my obligation is to be the champion of someone or something that in our society is not looked upon as mainstream, or the person who was chosen. And I look at the different things that I've done.
Yeah.
So for example, I did Glee because I was the both picked on yet popular high school kid who was able to maneuver in the mainstream and yet was an outsider.
Can we talk about picked on and popular toward the end of the evening?
Yeah.
We'll get back to that.
So I was interested in writing about that, and that became, I thought nobody would ever watch that, but it did. And most recently when I did The People versus O.J. Simpson, I was never interested in O.J. ever, for a second. In fact, I would skim past that. The person that I was interested in the most, the voice, was Marcia Clark, because I feel that she's a victim of misogyny and sexism,
Absolutely.
and nobody talked about that. I'm interested in that person. And the things that I'm working on now, I think, like in your work, goes against the establishment, that presents a different point of view. I'm working on two things right now that are that. I'm doing a Prince Charles Diana story. And I'm very, very interested in Diana because she was one of the first to say, I won't be treated that way, my sons won't grow up with that point of view, and I will fight you. And in a weird way, in a sad way, she won in death. And another thing I'm working on that I'm very proud of, because I'm doing it in a mainstream network with a big budget and a big marketing campaign, is a series called Pose, which is about what it was like to be gay and transgender in New York in 1986, and the emergence of Donald Trump and the nouveau riche in that sort of world. And that's not an easy. None of these are easy to get on the air in a mainstream way. And what I'm interested in my career is not doing things independently. I'm interested in doing them in a mainstream capacity. So it's a long answer, but voice to me at this point is about shining a spotlight on people who are otherwise, not heard and not seen.
I just want to quickly mention the character of Kurt Hummel in Glee, which was one of my favorite examples of stealth politics, if you will, of a kind of moral imperative disguised as there was also entertainment. But here was I'm trying to think of a more fully developed gay male character before that, and nothing comes to mind. This kid was up against bullying and homophobia, and the biggest tormentor was a closeted gay kid. It was unflinching and so real, and then he falls in love.
Well, the great story about that was sort of based on me. It was really based on my father, and it was really based on the relationship I wanted to have with my father, but did not have. And the great victory of that story is when I first started off in Hollywood and writing in 1998, I was constantly bombarded with notes about that's too gay, take that out, the people will revolt, you can't have them kiss, you can't have them wear that. I had a 2-hour conversation once about a female character could not wear a fur coat because it was a gay aesthetic. So the interesting thing about Lee and the Kurt Hamel character and all of that stuff was, I fought, and at that point I was so angry that I wrote it and I said, if you want it, I'm going to put it on the air. But the thing that I loved the most was that story and that character became the thing that the new generation of network executives said, write more of that, lean into that, we want that. And I was like, wow. And 10 years, the dynamic changed and a group of people became powerful who were more liberal, compassionate, understanding. So to me, I was like, that's the victory. Not just the character, but the people who were paying to put that character on the air. That's my favorite thing about that story.
I'm wondering if there's not a disconnect between what people say we want to see versus what we actually want to see. That there's a disconnect in which we are told, oh, you can't put this character on stage, too gay, this is a character that's bullied, that we're actually, what I feel that we're fighting against is something that is a basic human need. And I call it negative empathy. That what we need to see and what we most identify with is that which we may be most in pain to reveal about ourselves, or scared of about ourselves, right? Or traumatized by that facet of ourselves. And when we are shown that, and we go, wait a moment, that is me, it releases that fear. It releases that sense of being alone. And so, I mean, that was right, the aesthetic word for it in the 19th century was negative empathy. That we really empathize most when we resist and we have to be pulled towards these portrayals, struggling and resisting and fighting, and finally we go, no, that's me. And that acceptance of oneself, of these different facets, is actually what we want to see. But how indeed do you present that? I mean, I don't know about if you must get this criticism all the time. I start with a script and people go, I don't like that character. I'm not going to play this woman, I don't like her. This is not a likable character, is one of the first responses I get. And I feel that it's not about likable characters, it's about characters that you actually feel desire and passionate about because you have an initial resistance. And the work overcomes that resistance. And I certainly, I mean, people with How I Learned to Drive, when I was, passing the play out, and I'm like, I want everyone to fall in love with this uncle. I fell in love with Humbert Humbert. I was absolutely seduced as a woman reader by Nabokov. How the hell did he do that? Do you like Humbert Humbert? I don't think I like him, but I think I'm mesmerized. I think that there's a growing desire on every page where my resistance is overcome. And I don't know if this resonates in terms of how you both write, but it feels to me like it's an argument that we have to keep fighting each and every script, each and every work, to get past that notion of likability or showing what people think people want to see.
Well, when I hear somebody say, I found this character unlikable, I kind of try to look professorial and say, I believe what you mean is you don't yet understand what it's like to be this character. We're not talking popularity here. We're talking penetration. We're talking, and I think what works about Humbert, for those of us who love him, is that Nabokov so thoroughly takes us into Humbert-ness. Right. That it creeps you the hell out, but you're there. You get what it's like to be him. He's not being offered up as some creep for our delectation, saying, wow, Humbert, fucking Humbert.
Yes. Yes.
Ryan, you want to talk about, I want to talk about likability and pulling in Indecent in play, which is amazing. There's a play within a play. There's this play from, I think, the turn of the century Yiddish play called God of Vengeance, in which there was a lesbian kiss, and it was performed in Yiddish for years, and nobody made any fuss about it. But then they translated it into English and brought it to Broadway, and the actors were immediately arrested for indecency. Part of what's interesting to me, reading up on it, was that it was objected to by all the prudes and assholes and etc. who we would expect would object to something like that. There was also a fairly significant objection among the Jewish community.
Yes.
Because they didn't like to see Jews portrayed unsympathetically. Could we talk, Ryan, would you start about what about the dissatisfaction of the portrayed character who has been too seldom portrayed? Does that make any sense at all? You know what I mean? I get flack. People say, no, this is unsympathetic to the gays. It's not good for whatever cause.
Yeah, I think that I can only speak personally what I do and how I handle that. And I would say that for me, what I'm interested in and what I've really tried to do in my life, my creative life, is I was very influenced by reading a lot about what Orson Welles did with a repertoire and community of like-minded people to surround yourself with. And I was always struck by the freedom that came from that. And he, as a writer and director, working with actors and production designers who were unflinching in their ability to maybe move towards somebody who wasn't Mary Pickford-like, you know? And so I have established a company where I do that. Like, I have a group of between 15 to 20 actors specifically, and who are that way, who are not afraid to play someone unlikable. You know, people like Jessica Lange, Sarah Paulson, Cuba Gooding Jr., Courtney B. Vance. And so I have this sort of group of people that is a great safety to me as a writer and a director, where I know that they believe that nothing human is ugly. And there's a great joy in working with like-minded artists about people who are willing to illuminate those sort of characters, because I believe, as I'm sure you do, that the more specific you are with a character, even an unlikable character or an unlikable act, the more universal the discussion becomes. And I've tried to sort of create my career in that way.
Yeah.
A couple more things. It seems that as the gates sort of slowly open, there is, if anything, more rather than less controversy about who gets to tell which story and how far are you allowed to stray from your own experience. This is a visual reference, but it's a Whitney Biennial, painting by a white woman artist named Dana Schutz of Emmett Till, who was an African-American man lynched in the 1950s. It's a portrait by a white artist of an African-American man in his casket. It was a huge uproar. People wanted to take it down. People talked about having it destroyed. What about that?
Can I throw out a couple of statistics here?
Sure.
All right, so I have taught playwrights for 24 years at Brown. And I've taught playwrights for 5 years at Yale School of Drama. And I've tracked all of them, pretty much, for 30 years. Here are the statistics right now. In theater alone, although 50% of plays are written by women, from the time I started, there were only 16% of plays written by women being done in the United States. It's now increased to 22%. The number for writers of color produced in the United States per season is 7% now. Whose story gets told? I don't feel, I mean, look, and it's very interesting. I always expect when I start to write something that I need to have the obligation to say to people face to face, because in theater, basically you are face to face, right? There's no film, you're there in the audience. I expect that the first thing that I should say to people is, I'm so sorry I offended you. Because in truth, you're writing a world, you're writing perspectives that are not your own. I stood in an audience and I apologized to men when I wrote Baltimore Waltz about my brother dying of AIDS because I was not HIV positive. And it was absolutely, I think, relevant, right? For people to say, how dare you, as a woman or a lesbian, write about HIV? But I do want to point out, as you know, that I was writing about HIV in a world in which there is Larry Kramer, in a world in which there is As Is by Bill Hoffman, in a world in which there are narratives written, wonderful narratives written about gay men with HIV. And that gives me a kind of permission when there is diversity. Diversity makes the field better, because diversity opens up the way that we empathize and identify. And I think it is a perfectly, astonishingly humiliating shame in this country that our arts are not accessible to all communities, and that we are stopping, and I know how they're stopped, and we all know how they're stopped. We read the stories, we read the emerging artists, we are there trying to mentor people, and there are more roadblocks. So I feel that I, as a white gay woman, my voice can only be strengthened as the stories of other people with a diverse point of view are put on stage. I am weakened by their absence. That's what
I have a sort of a long-winded, not as elegant version of Paula's story, but I can speak from my experience and what I feel. And I feel that the Hollywood experience, which is different than the theater experience, is, you know, there is a long tradition of being mentored by people who look like you. And if you look at Hollywood, the people in power are pretty much white men in their 50s, and they tend to mentor people who are 30 years younger and 2 inches shorter. And I was a victim of that. Nobody mentored me. I was gay, I was out, I was a little theatrical and flamboyant. So what happened to me is I got shamed personally into changing how I thought. And that was that I had a pretty long streak of success, and I was doing an episode of OJ this year ago that was about Marcia Clark. It was episode 6. It was called Marcia. It was very important to me to have the female director in that slot, so we got one. And 2 weeks or 3 weeks before we started filming, she had to have an emergency operation. She fell out. So I knew Sarah Paulson so well that I'm like, screw it, I'll step in, and I directed it. And I felt bad that I did that. And I looked at my behavior, and I said, well, what does it say about me that I am running this company that employs 400 people and I don't have 5 brilliant women on speed dial who I can call up and say, hey, step in at a moment's notice. So I decided at that moment that I had failed and that I needed to change my behavior. So what I did is I went to my boss and I said, what I want to do is, I think the problem with a lot of things happening in this town is that we pretend that we're making a change, but we don't quantify it and we don't clarify it. We have workshops, we have programs, and we put people through them, and then we send them off to the wind, and we don't give them jobs, and we don't really do anything.
Right.
So I wanted to create and change, and I did, and I created a foundation called the HAT Foundation.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to talk about the HAT Foundation.
Well, it's a very simple idea, and it's funny that you say that statistic, 16%, because it's exactly the same in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Only 16% of all television is directed by women, and only 7%, again, that number is directed by people of color. So I was a victim of that at my company. I was doing a little bit better. We were like 21%, but I said, you know what we're going to do is we're going to say, from now on, from this day forward, 50% of all of the episodes that are directed in my company will be women. 50% will be minorities. We're going to change the crews. We're going to make sure that all the department heads that I work with, that work for me, know that from this day forward, the most important thing they can do is hire people in voices that are not like them.
Right.
So a year into that,
Right.
I thought it was going to be so hard to do, and my boss was going to say, well, let's talk about it. They immediately said yes. So a year into this company, this foundation, 65% of all the directors of my company are now women, and 94 are minorities. Jobs, I try and give them development deals. So if you come to my company and you work for me, the first thing I say to you as a woman, as a minority, what's your dream? And my idea is to try and have people then be able to create their own show or follow their own dream. I talked about the show I'm doing called Pose. I feel what's interesting to me is I'm not African American, I'm not transgender, but there's a lead character who was like me in 1986. So what I've done is I've gone out into the community, and I have a writing staff where our goal, we're still hiring, is to be 75% minority, transgender, gay in that culture. But every one of those people gets a development deal so that they can then sell their own pilot and try and get that into the system. And I feel like empowering and unifying as a community is the way to go. And I'm actually really, really deeply ashamed that it took me so long to figure out and just to stand up and say, no, we've got to change the system. In the way that you change the system is just saying, today.
The question is, which is great, is how long does it take us to learn what the system is?
Yeah.
It takes a long, long time. Like, this is kind of crazy. I'm 65, and I just finally experienced the Broadway system. And people are like, wow, how was that? I'm like, well, just like off-Broadway, just a little bit bigger. So, you know, I think the thing that I'm struggling with is how do we critique our systems? How do we critique whiteness, maleness, femaleness without it being a specific attack or feel like a specific attack against individuals who can help to change the system, people in the audience or readers who are picking that up? How do we shift our notion? And I mean, it's very interesting right now. I mean, we all know what time it is, that we're in this age, a lot of people don't want to say his name, but in the realm of 45, right as we're about to experience finally this demographic change in what and who makes America.
Right.
So we're right now, I think, in this moment of a kind of almost knee-jerk resistance.
Yeah.
To looking at this, can we talk about what whiteness means, and that it's not just the default race, right? Can we talk about what maleness and femaleness means in order that these things shift? And I feel like, I don't know if you're feeling this, but there's almost an interesting sense of stasis, of not wanting to make too dramatic a choice in a lot of not-for-profits. Almost like, let's just see which way the wind is blowing. A kind of concern in a lot of places.
Yeah, I feel that too, and I decided that now is the time where I am going to fight back with what I'm putting on the air, what I'm writing about.
Yeah.
I'm writing about women, I'm writing about minorities, I'm writing about the people that I feel that the government is trying to squash those voices. I feel like in television we've had decades of the white male anti-hero show, and anybody in a position of power has a responsibility to bring up and illuminate other voices. And the thing that I'm finding in my company with this foundation, young women in their 20s and 30s, in their 30s, the thing that I'm trying to do is mentor them and basically say to them something that I'm so thrilled to be a part of, which is in our country right now, women are the majority of our country, so why are you acting like a minority? You have to demand certain places at the table, and you have to demand a certain way to be treated within the system to change the system.
Yes.
And you have to, and I feel like the more social media exists and the more voices speak out, it's happening. I feel it happening in our system. Maybe we do live in a blue bubble, but I just feel like it's the time to get angry and to demand change. And maybe you can't change the world, but you can change your community.
Well, I actually think that changing who we identify with and who's represented is a big change and an important change.
Yeah.
And I actually think that younger writers are an incredible resource for that change. And so the question is how do we get younger voices on stage, on film, in print, sooner rather than later?
I agree.
So how do we remove the gatekeeping in a way that keeps a younger generation thinking, you know what, I want to be an artist. You know what, I want to spend my life writing these stories. And the only way to do that is to try and think about how does our system work? How can we help remove the gates, right?
Yeah, and it's common sense. I mean, the most moving moment I had in the past year of my life was when we announced the HALF Foundation. There was a woman with a child who, she was 35 years old, divorced, single mother, and she called and she said, I didn't even know it was possible to be a female director, to be a woman who's directing. And what we have done is I heard that voice. And so within this foundation, we have a childcare system. If you want to be a director, you can still be breastfeeding. We want to make sure that you have a room, that you have rights. And the other thing that we've done within the foundation is to actually pay women and minorities to be a mentee.
Right.
Because I think that too often in the world with women and minorities, and I felt this is one of them, not a woman, but a minority, saying like, okay, well, you come to us, you can be a part of our system, you can stand in the shadows. You did it for free, you worked your ass off, you many times were not rewarded. And I feel like, well, if you're a single mother, how are you going to stand on a set all day if you don't have the money for childcare or your rent? So we should provide that for you.
Right.
And it was such a simple thing to do, and it's such a humane thing to do. And I think that it just takes a new generation of people, you know, being, for me, I was shamed, but I also was angry, you know, I was angry that different groups are not allowed into this sort of playpen. And so I just spoke up. That's what I did to bring change, and what I tell my children, my two young boys. It sounds political, but it's just a common way of living.
Right.
You know, my darlings,
I know.
I feel like I can't imagine I am alone in the room with this feeling. If Ryan Murphy and Paula Vogel are this pissed off and asking these kind of questions and taking this kind of action, there is a chance that the assholes are not going to win. And thank you both. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, Paula, and Michael. And once again, our thanks to you all for being here and supporting the Fine Arts Work Center. Please step outside and enjoy drinks, conversation with our honorees, and a terrific light supper provided by Max Ultimate Food. See you tomorrow night. Thank you for coming.